Love this podcast? Support this show through the Acast supporter feature. It's up to you how much you give, and there's no regular commitment. Just hit the link in the show description to support now.
My dad works in B2B marketing. He came by my school for career day and said he was a big ROAS man. Then he told everyone how much he loved calculating his return on ad spend. My friends still laugh at me to this day.
Not everyone gets B2B, but with LinkedIn, you'll be able to reach people who do. Get a $100 credit on your next ad campaign. Go to linkedin.com/results to claim your credit. That's linkedin.com/results. Terms and conditions apply. LinkedIn, the place to be, to be.
Hey, I'm Ryan Reynolds. Recently, I asked Mint Mobile's legal team if big wireless companies are allowed to raise prices due to inflation. They said yes. And then when I asked if raising prices technically violates those onerous two-year contracts, they said, "What the f*** are you talking about, you insane Hollywood ass?" So to recap, we're cutting the price of Mint Unlimited from $30 a month to just $15 a month. Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 upfront payment equivalent to $15 per month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Taxes and fees extra. Speed slower above 40 gigabytes. See details.
Ready to pop the question? The jewelers at BlueNile.com have got sparkle down to a science with beautiful lab-grown diamonds worthy of your most brilliant moments. Their lab-grown diamonds are independently graded and guaranteed identical to natural diamonds. And they're ready to ship to your door. Go to BlueNile.com and use promo code LISTEN to get $50 off your purchase of $500 or more. That's code LISTEN at BlueNile.com for $50 off. BlueNile.com, code LISTEN.
This is Writers on Film, the only podcast dedicated to books on cinema. Hello everyone and welcome to Writers on Film. My name is John Bleasdale. I'm a writer and film critic, and today I'm going to be talking to Melanie Williams, who is the author of a new book, a new BFI Classics, on the wonderful film A Taste of Honey. Melanie is a lecturer and writer at the University of East Anglia, and we talk about the film and matters arising. If you like the episode, remember to subscribe and like and spread it as far and wide on social media. You can tweet as well and write reviews. Please do that if you can. But before you do any of that, enjoy the conversation.
Quite hard to trace, actually. I can't really remember exactly the first time I saw the film, but I was quite a film buff as a teenager, so I watched lots and lots of black and white films from that era and earlier as well. So I imagine it was probably among that glut of viewing that I first saw the film and really liked it and appreciated it.
Whereabouts are you from, by the way, Melanie?
I'm from Bristol, so yeah, nowhere near where the film is set. I don't have that kind of like local connection to it. I suppose the closest you get to that would be a film like Some People. Have you seen Some People?
Some People. The name's familiar.
Yeah, it's a sort of new wave film, but in colour, and it was filmed in Bristol in sort of early 60s, and it's got Ray Brooks in as this sort of disaffected young man who joins a youth club and does the Duke of Edinburgh award scheme. But it's a really sweet, like, intelligent film about youth. But I think that's the closest that whole kind of kitchen sink new wave movement got to coming to Bristol. Otherwise, obviously, it's quite a northern and some London, but always on the periphery in the southwest.
Yeah, Bristol's quite underserved in terms of films, unless I'm missing some sort of massive film that you're going to go, well, what about this? And then I'll say, oh my God, yeah, of course.
No, I think you're right. I mean, there are a few, but it's, certainly not had the, attention paid to it or the use of it as a location as some other places in Britain. But it just means, I suppose, it's a well-kept secret, cinematically speaking. Someone will do it. They'll make the great Bristolian film, whatever that might be.
At the same time, I sort of think that coming from sort of a place which is a little bit marginal, a little bit out of the way, you can easily sort of see yourself in films, even if they're geographically, not from that same area. I mean, I'm from Barrow-in-Furness, which is really, although it's from the north and everything, it's so far away from all those Bradford, Bristol, Manchester places. It's 2.5 hours. You're probably closer to Bristol, actually, to Manchester than I am,
Probably, yeah. Yeah, I was talking about being peripheral, but that knocks it into a cocked hat.
Well, Barrow-in-Furness is the periphery of the periphery. So when you were growing up in Bristol, how did you become a film buff? What were the sort of films that attracted you?
Oh gosh, I used to really like old Hollywood films that were on BBC Two, and that BBC Two's like tea time slot, where you'd see all kinds of old nonsense, and Channel 4 as well, having like a week of Edward G. Robinson films or something, where I'd kind of come back from school or come back from sixth form and settle down and enjoy those very much. So I also got quite into reading about Hollywood and filmmaking generally. So I got a lot of biographies out of the local library. And one book that I used to get out again and again was now David Shipman's The Great Movie Stars, which is like a multi-volume, basically this big book all about different movie stars, mainly focused on Hollywood. I don't really know why that was so interesting to me. I really don't know. I did go to a sort of educational event at the Watershed, which was the like art centre cinema thing in Bristol, and they showed The Third Man, and that absolutely knocked me out. I thought this was, well, an amazing film. Fantastic to see it on the big screen, and I suppose that really consolidated my love for old cinema, black and white films, but British films as well as Hollywood films, and just a range of whatever I could see really, and a broader sense of cinephilia. So I was also going to see modern films as well, so it wasn't just the old stuff. That was the gateway really to being really kind of fascinated by this whole world, I suppose, and that's what got me into that. And then I did an English degree, and as part of that I did some additional like film options. And
was that at Bristol, the degree?
No, I went to university at Hull, so I went to the opposite side of the country, because I was quite a Philip Larkin enthusiast, which is not something that you'd necessarily freely admit to anymore.
Oh, I love Philip Larkin. I love him.
It was exciting to be in the library that he was like marching around in. Obviously, after I was after that time. He was dead and gone by the time I went to university, but it was interesting. In the department, there were people that had obviously known him and worked with him, and it's a fantastic city. It had a very bad reputation, very unfair reputation for a while. Yeah, it's a fantastic place. So kind of interesting, and so much rich heritage, and kind of literary heritage and cinematic heritage, as I found out. There's practically all of 50s British cinema you can probably trace to about 3 neighbourhoods in Hull. You've got J. Arthur Rank, you've got Gerald Thomas, you've got Ralph Thomas, Kay Kendall's off from Withensea, Ian Carmichael. It's an amazing. I just thought that was a really strange interesting coincidence that so many people from Hull had ended up defining British cinema in that period. I suppose these things happen for a reason, don't they? You end up where you're meant to end up.
I would never have thought of Hull as being sort of this nexus of British cinema talent.
Yeah, well, Surprisingly so, yes.
I'm really interested hearing you talk about The Third Man as well, because that's such an interesting crossover film, I think, because it has the American Hollywood of Orson Welles and Joseph Cotton, but it also has Trevor Howard, and it has the sort of William Hart White and that sort of Britishness. So Carol Reed, who's sort of like more British than the British, if you know what I mean, coming from, I think it's Hungarian, wasn't he, originally, his family?
Oh, I don't know. I'm not aware of his provenance.
Yeah, I think Carol was initially sort of a K name. And of course, Oliver Reed's uncle.
Yes, yeah. So there's another family tree there, isn't there?
I mean, I must admit, Taste of Honey, for me, was a very recent discovery. I watched it for the first time, I think, last year. In a way, the thing that I'd sort of gone through quite a few of these sort of kitchen sink films, so to speak, or the social realist films of that period. Loneliness of a Long Distance Runner, Saturday Night, Sunday Morning, Look Back in Anger. I was much more familiar with and found them sort of admirable, but not particularly enjoyable, if that's not sacrilege. But when I watched Taste of Honey, it struck me as so much better than all of those films.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, I don't know what it was. I think maybe it was because the other films had this sort of working class masculinity, which I very much recognized, but they seem to endorse. They seem to go, yeah, look at how rude Albert Finney is, and look at how horrible Richard Burton is to his girlfriend. That's what, and it's a sort of almost like a middle class version of working classness, or valuing the sort of a certain level of behavior, a certain type of behavior, because it's authentic. When I come from that background, and there are elements of truth there, but there are elements of other truths as well. I
think it is slightly anomalous. That group of films always get talked about as a kind of lumped together because they do share certain features, and they're all kind of literary or stage adaptations. There's a kind of tight, coherent time period that they belong to. But A Taste of Honey is anomalous because it is the only one that really has that kind of, female author and more of an interest in a female experience, I think. I mean, not that the other films are completely absent of that. You have got some notable characters played by the likes of Rachel Roberts and Simone Signoret and so on. But A Taste of Honey, I think, is different because it sort of speaks with the female voice and is interested in the young woman's experiences and her relationship with her mother, as well as her relationships with her friend Jeff and her boyfriend Jimmy. But she's determining the action, and so many of the other films, an unexpected and unintended pregnancy is kind of like, it's about how it impacts upon the male hero and his right to roam freely, whereas this is much more about her experience and what she does, and how she is going to live with the consequences of this, and her ambivalence towards it. There's that amazing scene both in play and film where she rejects motherhood. She doesn't want to be a mother. For a start, she's still quite young, but also, and this is at the height of that cult of maternity, where being a mother is seen to be the kind of acme of female achievement, and that's being kind of rejected here. And coming from a teenage female playwright who's then adapting her own play for the screen. I mean, it's an amazing moment of a new kind of voice breaking through into the mainstream. And that might be one of the reasons why it felt different, I suppose.
Absolutely. I mean, I think those other films I watch, and I'm constantly having to hedge my reactions to them in the sense of like, oh, well, in those days that was sort of considered revolutionary, and in those days that was considered advanced, even though it seems retro to us now. But with this film, you don't have to make any allowances for it. It's totally, and I think, as your book so ably demonstrates, a lot of that is actually down to Shelagh Delaney's authorship, even though she sort of, as you quite rightly says, there's a tendency to minimize her contribution, and in order to make Tony Richardson the more sort of, the auteur in this case. Just before we go on, let's just in case our listeners haven't watched it as recently as I have, and I'm sure obviously you're very familiar with. Can you give us a sort of like précis of the film as a way of helping them out?
Yeah, sure. So it's set in Salford, in the northwest of England, and there's this very sort of distinctive landscape of canals and docks and kind of, the sort of landscapes that are familiar from the paintings of Lowry, who's also from Salford. So the setting is quite important. And you've got Jo, who's a teenage school leaver. She's in the last weeks of secondary school, and she lives with her mother, Helen, they don't get on very well. So they're quite antagonistic and disagreeable with each other. And Jo has a relationship with Jimmy, who is someone she meets initially on the bus and then bumps into again. And he's a black sailor. He's a ship's cook working on one of the big ships that's kind of docked in the area. And they have this very fleeting, very sweet kind of romance. And they get engaged and they spend one night together, and then his ship has to sail. Unfortunately, Jo finds herself pregnant as a result of this kind of one night together, and she decides to start her own life. So she's left school, she gets a job in a shoe shop, and she meets Jeff, who is gay, who has been chucked out of his previous accommodation, and him and Jo kind of set up this kind of flat share together, but also this like improvised family unit as well. And that's in contrast with the distinct lack of family care that's come from Jo's own mother, who's got married to Peter, who's a slightly spivvy second-hand car salesman. And I suppose what happens is all these different personalities and the kind of conflicts between them. The big narrative countdown is through Jo's pregnancy, and the film ends as she's about to go into labour, I think the film strongly suggests. But I won't say more than that, because that would give away what happens in the end and who ends up living with who. But that's a flavour of what it's about.
Oh, brilliant! That's perfect. One thing that I didn't know as well, and you reveal it in the book, that Shelagh Delaney is actually in the film at the very beginning as one of the sort of young women behind Jo as she leaves school.
Yes, she makes a cameo appearance in the opening sequence when Jo is playing netball at school and hates playing netball, as many of us hated playing netball at school. In the background of the shot, one of the people looking at this match, silently looking on, is Shelagh Delaney. Who's very kind of, she was very tall, she's very statuesque, quite a kind of imposing and glamorous figure. And I think it's really interesting to have her taking a bow, to borrow a Smiths reference, which you can hardly avoid doing when talking about A Taste of Honey, because it was obviously very influential upon Morrissey and on the Smiths. But
were you a big Smiths fan?
We talk about that more. I mean, that's one of the ways in which lots of people my age or may like encounter some of these films, and right. Because Morrissey was such a kind of big fan and a powerful advocate for them, and used the dialogue as lyrics, and used the images from several of these films, or the kind of the writers of them, for posters and sleeve art and all of that kind of stuff. And obviously we know where Morrissey's ended up ideologically. And I think that was one of the things that I wanted to think about in writing this. Has there been a kind of reputational contamination, in a way, that such a powerful advocate for Delaney and her work has subsequently taken this very kind of right-wing turn. Is that a problem? What was it that appealed about this to Morrissey? Can we extricate it from the journey that he's taken? So in some ways it's a kind of sweet northern fable, and in other ways we might think about it in relation to these bigger questions of how old films and nostalgia for the past are mobilized in the present. And that's a bit of a hot mess, isn't it, really, in terms of culture wars and the good old days and what that means to some people.
I mean, I would push quite vigorously against that idea in the sense that I don't find the film nostalgic. I don't feel that the central appeal of the film is nostalgia. That you might want to use iconic images as or make images iconic, and I definitely understand a lot of people's despair at Morrissey. I think I wasn't as invested in Morrissey as a lot of. To me, he was just a singer, and I've never put much credence in the political views of a singer. I mean, David Bowie was a fascist. I mean, let's not forget that. I mean, Philip Larkin. I love Philip Larkin. Ezra Pound, T.S. Eliot, Virginia Woolf. There are lots of.
There's a lot of it about.
Paul Newman says in Hood, if you separate the saints from the sinners, you're lucky if you're left with Abraham Lincoln. I think this culture war idea is to me, and this might, hopefully doesn't sound too simplistic, but it feels to me like we're accepting the right wing's ground of battle, and I disagree with its premises. So I don't even see that there needs to be a culture war necessarily. Would be, I don't. Yeah. What do you think, Melanie? I mean, but please, by all means, push back.
I guess being in an arts and humanities faculty in a British university at present, I don't feel that I can ignore the culture wars, because I think one of the reasons why there's continual kind of media trolling of, these things not being worthwhile and being a kind of hotbed of pinko, all that kind of discourse and wokeness and other words that are essentially been rendered meaningless. I don't feel I can ignore it, because I think it has implications for the context in which we work and we're allowed to work. Yeah, I suppose that's what I'd say. That, I think that the premise of it is entirely false, but the waging of the culture wars has real world consequences that are impossible to ignore. But it's a grim time to be trying to make a case for doing things other than subjects that serve employers, or so it was interesting to think about this stuff in the context of being in a film and media department in one of the universities that was designated the most woke in the UK. So you feel like you're walking around with a target on your back in some ways.
No, and I don't in any way mean to sort of belittle or minimize that. It's not so much an ignoring of the culture wars as sort of like a strategic, I'm not going to fight your battles where I know you're going to ambush me. I'm going to fight my battles way beyond that.
You have to hold on to what you think actually matters and try and connect with the other people that are out there. And
and with A Taste of Honey, and with what I feel is how fresh this film still feels, and that's what it feels like that is pushing against any sense of nostalgia, because nostalgia is ultimately sort of a patronizing of the past by the present. It's sort of like, oh, well, wasn't it all cute? And you have some great points where you point out, like, oh, look at the hot water bottles underneath the sink there. This is a cold, cold apartment. It's not as much as it might be wonderful as a space where this inclusion is taking place. It's also a place that's bloody cold.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it is a film that sort of pushes back against any cozy nostalgia. I mean, I was, one of the things I quoted was Simon Heffer did a sort of editorial talking about the television channel Talking Pictures and how this the kinds of old film and television that it showed were not PC, but it provided a kind of nostalgic comfort blanket for people, particularly during lockdown. And I just think that's much too simplistic, and it sort of minimises the complexity of the talking pictures. I'm a huge fan of. They show wonderful stuff, but also that stuff is complex. It's not just bobbies on bicycles and, you know, the kind of British version of the beginning of like Blue Velvet, you know, everybody waving in slow motion and being happy in their communities. You know, there's often some really dark, questioning material being dealt with there, alongside things that are a bit more cosy. It's a real mixture. And so to sort of see all of that steamrolled, by inference suggesting that anyone who's interested in that stuff is just hooked on nostalgia and not because they're interested in this historical material that still speaks so eloquently, I just think it's a simplification. And, you know, with A Taste of Honey, you've got these kind of lone mother characters who speak back. They refuse to kind of know their place and be thankful. They have aspirations of different ways of living. And the two sympathetic male characters, one's a person of colour, the other one is queer. You know, it's a film that at the time was trying to tell different stories and you know, present different kinds of people in very sympathetic ways. So it's, yeah, I think it presents a view of that moment as not entirely fantastic, but people are trying their best within that and trying to make a kind of good life for themselves. But that proves quite difficult because, you know, there's no interesting jobs to do if you're a female school leaver. Your options are very limited. Your mother's options are limited. The options of all the people surrounding you are very limited as well. But at the same time, there's this kind of impulse to try and do things differently, to be artistic, to be kind of interested in the world around you, to be creative and poetic. And I think that's one of the lovely things about the film, is that comes across so strongly.
Wear Italian shoes.
Yeah, exactly. These sort of groovy espadrilles, and like move into this squat with your friend and decorate it and like turn it into this haven. I'm obsessed with Joe and Jeff's flat in A Taste of Honey, that they do this lovely makeover on and string up all these interesting mobiles and postcards and curtains and do all this like cooking and decoration. It's like this little domestic idyll, really, this space where things are possible. But then it also takes that out onto the streets as well. You know, they're a place where you can kind of have adventures and you can declare yourself bloody marvellous. Yeah, walking around under the railway arches and, you know, refuse to be downtrodden. You know, in spite of everything, you can still say, you know, we're amazing, we're fantastic.
Absolutely. Hit the north. Get some of that spirit, and it's not it's grim up north. It's much more. There's a triumph to it. I mean, the thing that I really reacted to on my first watching was how much none of the characters just fell into types or stereotypes or tropes. They were all. There was this willingness to have a conversation, even between them. That was so. It's not like, oh, we're just going to forget race because we've got and that'll be the way we'll not be racist. No, we're going to have a joke about it. We're going to talk about it. We're going to address it, because that's exactly what people do. People don't walk around ignoring race as a way of sort of being anti-racist or being non-racist. In fact, in some ways, that sort of liberal attitude of being colorblind, as we've seen, is an extremely weak way of approaching race that collapses, you know, that collapses in an instant. And similarly with Jeff, played by Melvin Murray, who sadly passed for quite recently.
Yeah, but yeah, wonderful performance. Yeah.
You quote Dirk Bogarde saying to him, you know, you did more for gay visibility in 5 minutes of that character than I did in the whole of Victim.
Yeah, I think that's such an interesting thing, isn't it? Because Victim is a remarkable film, and Bogart's performance is amazing in it, and it's a very brave film for him to make as well as
This episode is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Do you ever find yourself playing the budgeting game? Well, with the Name Your Price tool from Progressive, you can find options that fit your budget and potentially lower your bills. Try it at progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Price and coverage match limited by state law. Not available in all states.
My dad works in B2B marketing. He came by my school for career day and said he was a big ROAS man. Then he told everyone how much he loved calculating his return on ad spend. My friends still laugh at me to this day.
Not everyone gets B2B, but with LinkedIn, you'll be able to reach people who do. Get a $100 credit on your next ad campaign. Go to linkedin.com/results to claim your credit. That's linkedin.com/results. Terms and conditions apply. LinkedIn, the place to be, to be.
Did and Ralph and the other people involved, but it's very much a kind of melodrama, and it's approaching the topic in that way as as kind of one of it's the engine for powerful drama and confrontation. Whereas there's an opposite version of that in A Taste of Honey. I sort of talked about it as he's kind of queer and quotidian, like this is every day. This isn't big melodramatic revelation. There's a kind of bit of a back and forth between Joe and Jeff about it, and she's a bit nasty sometimes, and he's quite rightly sort of defensive and sticks up for himself. But that's not even necessarily the most significant thing about Jeff. It's part of him and who he is, but it's the film takes a different approach to it, I suppose, and that character is a fully rounded character. There are all kinds of different aspects to his personality, and yes, some of it is a little bit stereotypical. So the kind of him being a sort of textile art student and being very adept at running up curtains and doing interior design and buying these kind of Italian shoes and being good at cooking. These are within the realm of stereotyping, but like all the characters, they kind of evade that straitjacket. They're all more complicated than the stereotyping would normally have space to allow for. So yeah, they've all got other things going on, haven't they?
Well, precisely, and I think that sort of goes against any idea that it's a stereotype as well, in the sense that stereotype seems to me to be something which is like a silhouette. It reduces all detail, but I mean, stereotypes coincide with reality. I mean, I've met more openly gay people in the film industry than I've met in Vickers Shipyard. I'm not saying there aren't gay people in Vickers Shipyard. There certainly are, but there's an openness. There's a certain space in the film industry that doesn't exist in the shipyard, and people tend to go to environments which welcome them rather than ones in which they have to hide and find hostility. So, there are reasons why certain stereotypes or certain shorthands of how we understand things exist. This film doesn't say that's all Jeff is. It's like saying, there's a point in the book where you refer to the sort of trope of the unhappy gay character.
It's Richard Dyer's idea of the sad young man as this recurring image of male gay identity.
And I agree, if that was all that Jeff was, that would be a legitimate criticism. But being gay in early 1960s Northern England, I imagine there were moments where you were feeling bloody marvelous, even if, and that makes the feeling bloody marvelous moments all the more meaningful because they come at a price.
Yeah, there's a sort of defiance in, like, I'm still going to stake my claim to be a marvelous person, and that moment being both Jeff and Joe together, sort of, telling each other how wonderful they are, I think is such a lovely inspiring moment. I sort of think if it was a bit later on, they'd like form a band and become superstars, you know. It's that idea, isn't it, of like the rest of the world doesn't get how wonderful we are, but we're going to show them. But, you know, what vehicle does that ambition, that marvellousness take? And
well, I mean, that's something that definitely makes this film stand out away from some of the other films that it's often grouped with, is it doesn't strike me as a pessimistic film at all. It strikes me as a film that's very optimistic.
Yeah, well, I mean, given the situations that are being presented, which could become very kind of dour, grim social realism, it's a deliberately very sort of lyrical, also very funny. I think, you know, there's some great hilarious comedy moments, really well performed by performers that are very skilled in. So there's great moments between Dora Bryan and Rita Tushingham as mother and daughter. Great moments between Jo and Jeff when they're sort of getting fed up with each other, and Jo's fed up with being pregnant and he's fed up with her being fed up. And, you know, really, I mean, I think Delaney's very good at writing that kind of crosstalk, that back and forth. And it's interesting that the original play had elements that were meant to be like done in the style of musical comedy acts, you know, that Helen in particular, Jo's mother, would sort of address the audience like she's like Max Miller or something, you know. And I think some of that leaches into the film as well. I mean, Dora Bryan's great performer who's very skilled in variety and review as well as legitimate conventional theatre, so she can kind of bring that style of performance into it. So it's, yeah, I think it's got comedy chops as well as, and not all the films of the British New Wave are, you know, This Sporting Life, for all its wonderful qualities, is a really grim film. Room at the Top doesn't have many laughs, but A Taste of Honey has got some very funny moments.
Looking forward as well, I can see sort of its influence on the cinema of Ken Loach and the cinema of, you know, especially early Ken Loach when maybe he wasn't quite as doctrinaire as he would become. And
I think more immediately, like Coronation Street, obviously, right. That begins before the film of A Taste of Honey comes out. Like, that's the following year. But Tony Warren, who originated Coronation Street, is obviously set in the same kind of neighbourhoods. He'd seen A Taste of Honey and was sort of inspired by it and thought, yeah, I can write something about a kind of local neighbourhood. And some of the character types are kind of similar to what's going on. So I think, in a way, it's the progenitor of a whole set of like realist approaches to, you know, telling stories, particularly northern stories, I suppose. You know, you can still see its legacy, I think, in that way. I
remember when EastEnders first came out and people were sort of like, Coronation Street in London? I'm not sure this is going to work. It's not like we were so used to Coronation Street, even Crossroads and
yes.
Emmerdale, that EastEnders was this sort of new soap opera we didn't think would last.
That's fine, yeah. I suppose Albion Market didn't crack it, did it? Or El Dorado.
Exactly. People forget that there were this stream of sort of soapy dramas which you know didn't last. Yeah. do you remember Triangle?
Yes.
Something genuinely depressing.
Yeah, it's kind of littered with all these things that don't work. I mean, Delaney could have written for Coronation Street. She was asked to. Granada were very, I mean, understandably, you've got this playwright writing stuff that's, you know, very locally based. They were very interested in her writing for them, and she turned them down. She did do some episodes of Z-Cars, so she did do some writing for a kind of different northern realist tradition, but not Coronation Street. Maybe she just thought, okay, well, I've provided this formative influence. I don't really want to go back to that. And I think as well, you know, the success of A Taste of Honey when she was still a teenager, and it's a big kind of cause célèbre, and there's lots of speculation about, you know, how could she have known about such a sordid situation, one so young, and is this painting Salford in a bad light? And so lots of the council and the local press really pile onto her. I could see why you just think, I can't be bothered with that anymore. You know, I don't want to wade into that again. She does her follow-up play, The Line in Love, is again set in Salford, but yeah, I think beyond that, and moving to London, there's this ambivalence about the area. So you see that in things like the White Bus and Charlie Bubbles, and which of course is with Albert Finney, and it's all about someone who's been a famous writer going back home, and it's a really odd, kind of unsettling experience for him, and no one quite knows how to treat him, and he doesn't really feel connected to the place anymore. And I think there's some really interesting autobiographical stuff going on there about what happens when you are a provincial writer who makes it big, and what then is your relationship to your hometown and your community, and how do they feel about you and how do you feel about them. So I think all of that's to kind of come afterwards, really, in Delaney's career.
Of course, Ken Loach directed a few episodes of Z Cars as well, so there is that connection there. That process of I thought it was fascinating when you brought up I'm not sure if it was a politician or the editor, I think, of one of the Salford newspaper, who sort of really, as you say, piled on, and that seems to me such an intrinsically northern thing that we can't take pride in something that somebody is doing. We've got to sort of chop them off at the ankles.
Yeah, I think even more so because it's a young woman. How dare she? She should know her place and be thankful. And instead, she says when she thinks the council are doing stupid things when they're redeveloping areas and sticking up tower blocks, and she speaks out, and they don't like it at all. I think there's that sense that she's seen as uppity and misrepresenting the modern North to these theatre goers and film viewers down south. So she's seen as, a problematic figure in that way. I mean, some of the reviews of the original play, one isn't very positive about it, but says, it's the view of a savage society from a genuine cannibal. So it's kind of presenting Salford is like this, primitive society, and it's, mind-blowing. And I think some people in Salford worried that this was presenting stereotypes of northerners for southern delectation, and that's I don't think it is at all, but there's clearly a real sensitivity about how some of these kitchen sink, new wave, angry young man plays and novels are presenting the North. Why it's in some ways it's seen as great that people are interested, but in other ways they're like, why are they interested? What are they thinking about us? What impression are they getting from these stories? So there's an unease there as well.
I get that because sometimes I'm watching working class, sort of a drama set in a working class area or something. The sort of shameless, grungy...
Yeah, kind of poverty porn, that accusation.
Yeah, and it's not so much that. It's just that sometimes you feel like the person is making a film of somebody else's film of an idea of what working class life looks like. It's someone who's who's watched other films and thought, okay, I'll take a bit of this and a bit of that. But the problem with the poverty porn sort of idea is it often becomes an excuse then not to look at class, not to look at people who are from lower class, the so-called lower classes. My own criticism would sometimes be like, for instance, why do they have to have a dirty door? Why is that like the immediate signifier of a work? Because I know people who lived in terrace houses and their doors were the only place that they actually had any control over or pride in. So,
well, there's that stereotype, isn't there, of the scrubbing the step and making sure that all the stuff in Richard Hoggart's, the uses of literacy when he's talking about traditional working class northern communities, and that sense of domestic pride and civic pride that, make sure that your step was clean. Yeah. Because if not, you're seen as not upholding your role in a way, particularly for women and their sense of responsibility for the respectability of themselves and their family. Which, of course, is, again, one of the things that's interesting about A Taste of Honey, is that characters that are beyond the realms of this respectability. Helen, played by Dora Bryan, is not our mam, the figure that Richard Hoggart talks about, and there's that interesting comparison with with something like Coronation Street, where you've got different kinds of women. You've got the more traditional mums who are devoted to their families and their homes, and then you've got someone like Elsie Tanner, who's a mother, but she's also still wants to be kind of sexy, still, you know, is single, but is, you know, still trying to put up a glamorous facade. So there's this tension, I think, within working class femininity between respectability and something that might be seen as a bit iffy but more exciting. So I think you get that dimension as well in A Taste of Honey, that, you know, Helen, as played by Dora Bryan, is a kind of, you know, she's still trying to wear the glamorous clothes. She still wants to go dancing with the fiance at the dance hall. She still wants this life of excitement. And the film doesn't necessarily really disapprove of being that way, you know.
Yeah, sort of, in a way, it sort of mirrors Jo's own ambivalence about being a mother. It's like her own mother didn't necessarily want to be a mother. So, yeah, why should she want to be a mother? Helen wants to be, you know, bloody marvellous as well. Yeah.
She's refused to just become this sort of shapeless, sexless figure that Hoggart talks about, you know, that once you reach a certain age as a working class woman who's married and respectable, you rescind those things. And, you know, they're not up for rescinding those things because they're one of the few glimmers of like excitement and interest in their lives. And the title of the play and the film gestured towards that, you know, this idea of these little bits of pleasure that you have to pay for, you know, in very draconian terms. Those are the things that make life worth living.
Yeah, I mean, if it's not pushing it too hard, the whole film strikes me as A Taste of Honey in the sort of black and white expanse of cinema at this time. I mean, I got a real feeling reading your book and reading about the reception of it as well. It's a bit like watching Bob Dylan in that Penbaker documentary going around Britain, and he's so far ahead culturally of the moment that he is in, and the ability of the people around him to sort of receive it, because it's just like he's already in the late 60s and they're still in the 50s. And it strikes me the same is true of Taste of Honey. You've got this new world being absolutely represented and invented there, and that the rest of the world is going, oh, she's a bit ugly, you know, and that's how they're that's how they're welcoming it. They just or that the playwright is a bit ungrateful, as you know, she should be a little bit more have a little bit more civic pride.
Yeah, or they try and sort of, I mean, on the one hand, they're interested because it's something new and something different, and it's clearly significant in some way, but they try and find ways of domesticating it or making it more fit into the conventions. So, yeah, Shelagh Delaney is always being asked, you know, are you engaged? You know, are you getting married? Like that's the most important thing about her in a way. You know, you're just an ordinary girl, aren't you? And she's like, I'm not ordinary. She just doesn't. She sort of refuses to go along with those scripts, and points to something else that's sort of coming through the pipeline. Really, that she's gobby. She won't just put up with whatever nonsense is said about her, and she thinks that she has the right to sort of speak and be heard, and I think that's massively impressive. She does do this interesting thing of in correspondence with Joan Littlewood saying, oh, I've never seen a play before, but I've seen one now, and now I've written one myself, would you mind producing it? Which is fiction. She'd seen plays, she'd been in school productions, and she was very au fait with what was going on, but clearly thought this is a good tack, this will fly. So this is how I'm going to try and get myself noticed, and it works. I'm
going to invent myself as this sort of savant who just turns up. you know.
From nowhere, I've suddenly, but at the same time, she is coming from out of nowhere. She is, writing this thing. I mean, she's part of a whole group of people that, friendship group, lots of creative people and artists, but they are also like ordinary people in Salford. They're her schoolmates and, people that she knows from the sort of social scene. And they're all doing their own really interesting creative work. So it is all going on. And I'm, also thinking about the Beatles and that moment of the sort of late 50s, early 60s, when you've got lots of things that are fermenting and things are going to become visible and become mainstream. And I think it's such a fascinating moment in post-war British history, that kind of, before 62, 63, that kind of just before the moment where things shift. But it's all going on behind the scenes and waiting to happen.
Absolutely. Love Me Do is just, you mentioned in your first paragraph, it's just, it's just about around that time.
Yeah. And there is that link between, the way they present themselves as a group and the imagery of these films. There's some really interesting connections there. I think they in some ways their early work is like a sort of extension of some of these ideas and themes, and they sing A Taste of Honey on their first album.
There you go.
So it's perfect link.
Just final question. In terms of Shelagh Delaney's career, she goes on to have quite a long career after this, and with there's by no means is this a one-hit wonder career, but where would you place sort of Taste of Honey in her in that context, as it goes on?
Oh gosh, I mean it's such a big thing, and she's so young when it happens, and it's her first play. It's very difficult, I think, for it not to overshadow everything that comes afterwards, even though there's lots of really fantastic stuff that comes after. I mean, the screenplay for Dance with a Stranger, the Ruth Ellis film that she does in the 80s, is brilliant. Such a good piece of work. Later things like Charlie Bubbles as well, and she worked on television, she worked on radio, she did some really interesting stuff. But A Taste of Honey is so massive, and it's on the school curriculum, and then Morrissey is continually quoting from it. It's very hard. And I think there is also a sense that Jeanette Winterson alluded to when she was talking about Shelagh Delaney. It's almost like, well, we're only going to let you have one success. We're going to turn you into a 9 days wonder or a one-hit wonder, and that she doesn't get the support beyond that initial success in a way that Winterson talks about Pinter. That it takes him a while to find his place, and then he does, and then obviously he has the career that he has, and that Delaney didn't have the same mentorship. I mean, maybe she would have if she'd stayed working with Joan Littlewood, but that relationship has its own kind of tensions and difficulties. So she's kind of left to her own devices a little bit, and I think that shapes what happens later on. But she's a really important voice in that moment and afterwards, and a really important writer who did more than one play.
yeah, absolutely. That's an interesting. I never thought of it in terms of Pinter as a comparison, but just in terms of career and the trajectory of the career. But that's a very interesting point.
Well, and at the West End premiere of A Taste of Honey on the stage, they just talk about what Shelagh Delaney is wearing. She's not wearing a jumper anymore. She's wearing a lovely white dress with silver slippers, and Pinter doesn't get that nonsense. They're not talking about John Osborne's shoes. There's just a completely different approach to women writers that means that they're trivialized. They're talked about in different terms. So it's not a level playing field, even for someone as prodigiously, obviously talented as Delaney. They still just want to talk about her hair and her, what shoe she's wearing.
It's a brilliant film, obviously. But it was a really great. I love these BFI classics. They're such a wonderful way of sort of going deep into a film and getting an opportunity to rethink it and relive it. And this is no exception to that.
Yeah, it was a thrill to be able to write for that series because it's such a great series. So many great books, so many fantastic writers. So yeah, being able to join that company was a real thrill and an honour.
Yeah. One final question is, could you recommend a film book for us? Because we'd always like to have some extra reading on this podcast.
I'll go back to David Shipman's Hollywood Movie Stars book. That kept me company on many nights reading that and unlocking this whole world of the classical Hollywood system and all the different films they made and all the different kinds of personalities that appeared in them. So yeah, I think those Shipman's encyclopedias of film stars are just a wonderful read. Also very nicely illustrated. So yeah, it's like a deep dive into classic Hollywood.
And you still have them on your shelves?
I still have them on my shelves, yeah. I eventually bought my own copies rather than getting the ones out of the library over and over again.
I love the library, but I'm so bad that I've got so many late fees that at one point my local librarian just went, look, keep it. You've bought it now.
Yeah, it's sort of like, you've bought a share in it.
Exactly. There's a wing of the Barrow Library that was paid for by my late fees, I think.
Well, it's nice to make a contribution.
Exactly. My auntie was the children's librarian there, so
wow.
Yeah, she was a children's librarian for Cumbria for something, and yeah, I remember her. I remember Brian Patton coming to the library to do readings of his poetry and the beat poets, all of whom I ended up meeting at one point or another. But that was a really interesting. As a young teenager, meeting Brian Patton was very influential. Listen, Melanie, thank you so much for that. That was really interesting, and thank you for being my guest.
No, thank you for having me.
So that was myself and Melanie talking about A Taste of Honey. It's a film that if you haven't already seen, you will want to see now, I'm absolutely sure. Can I just remind everybody that there's a new podcast coming imminently called Cinema Italia, which is a new podcast about a personal journey through Italian cinema, as Martin Scorsese might say. Thanks very much to Elliot Atkins for the music, Ali Harwood for the art, and thanks to you, listener. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you next week.
Cue the fireplace and your favorite fall movie. There's nothing better than a cozy evening at home with a glass of First Leaf wine. First Leaf is a personalized wine club that delivers right to your door. Sounds magical, right? They get to know your favorite tasting notes, which varietals you enjoy, and whether you prefer sweet or dry wines. So in every shipment, you get bottles tailored to your unique palate. Go to tryfirstleaf.com/fall to get your first 6 wines for just $44.95 with free shipping.
Hey, it's Mark Maron from WTF here to let you know that this podcast is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. And I'm sure the reason you're listening to this podcast right now is because you chose it. Well, choose Progressive's Name Your Price tool, and you could find insurance options that fit your budget, so you can pick the best one for your situation. Who doesn't like choice? Try it at Progressive.com. And now, some legal info. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Price and coverage match limited by state law. Not available in all states.
My dad works in B2B marketing. He came by my school for career day and said he was a big ROAS man. Then he told everyone how much he loved calculating his return on ad spend. My friends still laugh at me to this day.
Not everyone gets B2B, but with LinkedIn, you'll be able to reach people who do. Get a $100 credit on your next ad campaign. Go to linkedin.com/results to claim your credit. That's linkedin.com/results. Terms and conditions apply. LinkedIn, the place to be, to be.